welcome to this home edition of the Middle East Report. And in today's program, we have a very special interview with Dick Cheney's former Middle Eastern foreign policy advisor, and his name is Dr. David Wurmser. Shalom, David. It's great that you can join us from the States. And I just want to say that I met you when I was a 24-year-old after I'd graduated from the University of Manchester. I just did my degree in modern Middle Eastern history. I was looking to work on issues relating to Israel and the Middle East. So I found myself in Washington, D.C. And I just want to thank you for the time that you invested in me. I learned so much about Israel. I learned so much about the Middle East, and it's just given me such a great platform in which I've able to build a career in broadcast journalism, and you've played a huge part in that. So a big thank you to you.
Thank you. That means a lot to me, but your listeners should know that of all the people I've met who are young in the next generation, you were certainly one of the ones at the top of the list of future prospects. And I think everybody's, it's a great honor to have been involved in your development earlier on. Wonderful.
I really appreciate that, David. And David, can you tell us about your background? You're born in Switzerland. You come from a Jewish background. So share with us something about your Jewish family.
Well, yes, I was born in Switzerland. I immigrated to the United States when I was 10 months old, so I don't remember it that much, although my whole family remained in Switzerland other than my mother and father and brother. So all my aunts and uncles and so forth. So obviously there's always been somewhat of a tie to Switzerland. As far as the Jewish family goes, my father raised us at least throughout most of our lives as a fairly observant Orthodox Jews. It faded a little bit for obvious reasons here in the 70s and 80s in observance, but we always did. Israel and Judaism was always at the center of our lives at home, and frankly, all the holidays and the rituals that we did on Friday night, all the way through my life, in retrospect, I think really played a major role in shaping the sort of character that I've become. And as I get older, the more I realize how critically important it all is, and how brilliant the entire structure and depth of Jewish religion is, and the revelation of the Torah and the Bible as a whole is truly a map for human evolution and brilliance. That I think the more you study it, the more you realize its depth and its endlessness in terms of wisdom.
Absolutely. And where did your passion for Israel and for the Middle East study come from? Where did you kind of gain that and know that you wanted to pursue a career in effectively international relations, being one of the top Middle Eastern advisors in the States, if not the world?
Well, I've always been interested in Israel, partly because my father and mother were always Israel was always a presence in our house. We had distant relatives in Israel, but it wasn't really that connection that was so prevalent. It was truly the fact that my father, having lived in the shadow of the Holocaust, and my mother, who had survived in Germany, in Czechoslovakia under German occupation in World War II, understood very well what the point of Israel was, extremely well what the point of Israel was. And from an early age, it was ingrained in me. I remember some of my first memories were from the '67 war and the immediate aftermath. I remember on the eve of the war, the fear that I saw my father have. I was only 6 years old, but it was so palpable that you could see my father was deathly worried that something awful could befall the Jewish people through the destruction of Israel. And it was a very real possibility. And then I remember the aftermath, him traveling to Israel and coming back with all the pictures. I remember the '73 war. This was always part of my life, essentially. And what happened was, when 1977, when I went to Israel for the first time, I was struck. I had gone to Europe many times, and there was a certain familiarity to Europe. But when I came to Israel, there was something different. There was something strange in the feeling. It was more like home. It wasn't an exotic place I visit for the first time. It was something more familiar. And I realized how much of my father's character, as much as I thought he was entirely Swiss, there was really such a massive Jewish aspect to it. That as he grew older, I'm now realizing how much of his professional life and how much of his own achievement in life was related to anchoring it to his own understanding of Judaism and the prevalence of Judaism in his own life. So I think Israel's always been there. I think Judaism's always been there as a very strong influence on my life from an early age. So I don't really see a precipitous event. Truly going to Israel for the first time in 1977 was a major event, but I was already there on some level, and that's why it felt like coming home.
Yeah, I can relate to that. My first experience being in Israel in 1996 with the University of Jerusalem and doing a summer program there for 3 months. There is no doubt something extremely special about being in Israel, and that a sense of home, but also part of our entire Judeo-Christian heritage stems from there. David, what was it that made you pursue a kind of career in understanding the kind of Middle East? Because you attended Johns Hopkins University in the States, didn't you?
Yes, I actually started Johns Hopkins as a physicist. I entered college in physics, but switched within a semester, within a half year, largely because I realized I was very interested not only in politics, but history, culture, that this was really where my passion was. So I started undergraduate in political science and in history, focusing very heavily on the historical aspect. Then about 2-3 years in my career undergraduate at Hopkins, I was offered the opportunity to combine my master's with my bachelor's and finish early. So overall in 5 years to my master's degree. So, but it involved doing the last year at the School of Advanced International Studies in Washington, but which was the Hopkins graduate program in international relations. So it was a natural slide from culture and history and political science into international relations. And my love for Israel and my interest overall in the Middle East made it very clear that it was going to be Europe and Israel that were the focus, and the course of Western civilization between Jerusalem and Rome and Athens that was going to determine my greatest interests.
And when did you get your break, as it were, to actually start working as a Middle Eastern analyst in Washington, D.C.? Because Washington is probably one of the very few capitals around the world where there is so much opportunities to discuss what's happening in the world, to gain a greater understanding, to meet like-minded people, and actually then have an influence, as you have done, on US foreign policy.
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head. The question of the like-minded people. I think the larger network that you enter into is the break that you get. It wasn't specifically a Middle East job that started my career. What it was I was in graduate school. After I did my master's, it was a very easy slide into the PhD program at Johns Hopkins, and my advisor was Fuad Ajami, who was one of the greatest scholars of the Middle East there had ever been. I even had the privilege of one semester having learned from Majid Kaduri, who was another great scholar of Islam, for example. And then there were several other professors, but between Fuad Ajami and Majid Kaduri, I got an inside sort of from the heart look of the Arab world, which of course, having been exposed heavily to Israel and involved heavily in Israel, this was a new world to me. But not an entirely unfamiliar world, because I'd also studied the history of the Middle East so deeply. So it was connecting the dots in a very passionate way as well. So those two started shaping my contact to the outside world. And then a third professor of mine, Professor Michael Vlahos, what happened was in my first or second year of my PhD, which was after the master's program, he introduced me to another professor of Soviet studies at the time, or Russian Soviet studies at Johns Hopkins, called Charles Fairbanks. And Charles Fairbanks had a program or a consultancy with the State Department at the time. This was still under the Reagan administration, to study the nuclear freeze movement in Europe. And he needed a research assistant. So I became his research assistant. And my first major project professionally was to really, truly examine the origins, the sources, ideology, and ultimately even the funding and interaction of the nuclear freeze movement with the Soviet Union, which hooked up with another interest of mine, which was the global terrorist network that we had seen, which had a very parallel structure, the one surrounding the Baader-Meinhof, the European terrorists, the PLO, et cetera. So this sort of introduced me to the world of the Cold War and the relationship of the Middle East, terrorism, and the various political currents of Europe in the framework of the Cold War. And that was really my first professional experience. The second one, which drew me much more into the issue of political theory, freedom, and the value of freedom in political philosophy, although I'd always been very interested in political philosophy from a historical and current point of view, was I got a job at the United States Institute of Peace, which was a US government think tank. And we were following the dissident movements in Eastern Europe. And in 1989, we had a series of meetings, one of which involved Martin Malia and another with Richard Pipes. And they had basically begun to tell us, this was early in 1989, before the fall of Hungary and so forth, that it could collapse and we should begin to think about it and what we do. So we started organizing a series of conferences that, as it turned out, when they occurred, they were happening right after the capitals were falling from the Soviet, were being liberated and falling from the Soviet Empire. So we would each week or 2 weeks have a conference with dissidents from the countries that had just been liberated. So this really introduced me in a very personal way. Although my mother had already had considerable experience being a refugee from Czechoslovakia in 1948, I knew very much about the Soviet Union, the dissidents, and so forth. But this was professionally my introduction to that world. So these were very seriously impressive, shaping events for me. To watch the liberation of people in Eastern Europe, to be so tied to Israel, to see the Cold War and its structure. These were informative events and formative events for me.
And David, you also spent time in the US Navy for 11 years. How did that shape your view, working on US Naval Intelligence as a reserve officer?
Well, naval intelligence was fascinating. It was also an understanding of the Navy, because an intelligence officer in the Navy is also a line officer, which means that, God forbid you're on a ship and an officer gets killed or something like that, and you're the ranking officer, you are in line to take over that ship, even though you're an intelligence officer. So I learned both the operational side of the Navy, and qualified actually to navigate a ship and then qualified to command a ship in port. I never made fully the qualifications for at sea, but certainly. So operationally, it was a tremendous experience, teaching me about responsibility, about how responsibility is handled by a military structure, how the Navy is organized, how the power of the United States is organized, and also how powerful it is. But it also, in intelligence, on the weekends, one weekend every month, I had to serve in the Pentagon at the National Military Joint Intelligence Center, which is the hub. If you think of our intelligence structure, the United States intelligence structure, like a wheel where you have all these spokes going out to various intelligent alert centers, whether it's the Treasury Alert Center, the White House Alert Center, the State Department, et cetera, they all come into a central hub that clears all the alert intelligence, the current intelligence that is to alert our policymakers, and that's at the National Military Joint Intelligence Center in the Pentagon. And on weekends, one weekend a month, I was the Middle East desk officer. So I had quite an exposure to our world of intelligence, as well as our world of policymaking, and saw the relationship between intelligence and policymaking, which was eye-opening to see how significant intelligence was being pushed and shaped by the top levels of the military and the policymakers, and to some extent distorted. On the other side, I also saw that the immense pressure for consensus dulled down and dumbed down intelligence to the lowest common denominator, which usually became much less useful than it could have been.
And David, when I met you in '99, you were heading up the Middle East program at the American Enterprise Institute, and you're literally formulating U.S. foreign policy back then under the when President Clinton was in power. And I know, having quite a few conversations with you, that you were extremely unhappy, and rightly so, about Clinton's approach to the Middle East, his approach to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And it was there that you helped to shape some of the policies for George W. Bush. Can you just share with us what it was like to head up the Middle East program at the American Enterprise Institute, and also explain to our viewers what a neoconservative is, because it's so important and it's so misunderstood by our mainstream media and those of the left that hate the likes of you and me?
Well, certainly. Heading up a program, the American Enterprise Institute did not have a Middle East program when I got there in '96. It had one early in the '80s, but in the big transformation of the American Enterprise Institute from '85 to '95 under Chris DeMuth, they had done away with the program. So I was brought on board, and I restarted the program. And of course, the wonderful thing about the American Enterprise Institute was it was truly, I think, if anybody were to study a think tank and how to properly organize and run a think tank, I think AEI in the '90s would have been the place to study, because what it was the administration of AEI, though they were incredibly intelligent, perceptive thinkers and writers in their own right, understood that their reputation would be built on building a proper environment for the best minds to flourish. So it was a hands-off approach. They worried about fundraising, which essentially meant they brought some of the best minds to a specific place to interact and write. That was their job. And what flourished from people like Dick Chaney and Richard Pearl and Michael Ledeen and many others, simply it was a stunning interaction. What was also fascinating was you had some of the best minds on the Soviet Union, Leon Aaron, some of the best minds on Asia, Gordon Chang, and so forth. You had tremendous thinkers on Europe. So you had this cross-fertilization where you could never be stovepiped. You could never retreat into a bubble. It was always a subject of discussion, interaction, and cross-fertilization of ideas. So it was truly one of the great places to work. And I look back on those days as one of the happiest in my life. Now, of course, what happened at that point was the various policy issues under the end of the Cold War, and then the rise of the Clinton administration. Not only was AEI a proper environment, but there was tremendous subject matter in Washington that needed to be addressed. I mean, the United States had won the Cold War, but it had nothing in terms of a strategy or really a solid set of ideas to understand how to proceed forward. I attribute that to some extent to George Bush, who wasn't really a man of great ideas. And the end of the Cold War for him were something that happened. He didn't understand how this fits into the course of human ideas and course of events. Those people at AEI, all of whom had tremendous knowledge of history, understood how this fits. So strategic ideas began to be formulated in this incubator. And what was going on with the Clinton administration, while by today's standards might be considered to be much more mild, back then, there were a lot of things going on that were shattering American consensus positions and moving away from what we thought were some of the values of the United States. The peace process, the Oslo process, which started in '93, was clearly one of them. Had been an icon of conservative thought, of American thought, that Israel and the PLO were not in the same league in terms of allies or interlocutors, that we were the ally of Israel and the PLO was a tenuous contact, not even a full partner in any sense of the word of peace, and that the framework of the peace process was flawed. So this became a major issue. And the other major issue, of course, was Iraq, that the war in '91 left an unresolved issue. And moreover, and this is something I think people need to remember when they study the Iraq war, that the way it looks now is, why did we do Iraq? But the way it looked then was that Iraq was not a static situation. Iraq was a situation in which you had a government that had used chemical weapons against its people, both in the north and the south. There were revolts of people, tremendous revolts that threatened the regime from both the north and the south, and then increasingly even among Sunnis. And the regime was increasingly cruel in its suppression of these dissidents and these movements. So here we were essentially looking at a country that was bursting at the seams to change the status quo. The international situation was becoming worse and worse and worse in terms of American currency, so and power in the world. So as a result, what you had was a tremendous fear that Iraq was going to become a major problem in the future, and it best be dealt with now. And of course, the Clinton administration was seemingly passive and allowing a deterioration that we felt was very dangerous in the region. Neoconservatives, there's two ways to look at neoconservatives. The first is an actual philosophical movement, which are a group of intellectuals, many of whom started out on the left, and indeed even far left, Trotskyites and so forth, of thinkers, many of whom had been students of Strauss, the great philosopher Leo Strauss, and Alan Bloom at the University of Chicago. So the University of Chicago had a tremendous influence. And they created a philosophical group of people whose central point of reference was the battle between tyranny and freedom and the dynamics of tyranny. So as time went on, this group became very alienated from the new left in the United States and turned toward the conservative side, hence the name neoconservative. And it's a very narrow group of people who really should be considered in that group: Irving Kristol, Norman Podhoretz, etc. Over time, the children of that generation, as well as a number of others, were included in that rubric of who are neoconservatives. But I think what it really means is a group of people who, in their youth, had been a bit more toward the left. In the case of Bill Kristol, Irving Kristol's son, Richard Pearl, Frank Gaffney, and others, they started their career on the Democratic Party side with Scoop Jackson. So you had a group of people who departed from the Democratic side in the late 70s, including Reagan himself, Ronald Reagan himself, who once famously said, "I never left the Democratic Party, they left me." So there was a sort of feeling that the Democratic Party under McGovern and others had been moving to the left, that left a group of people who felt they had no more home in the Democratic Party to move to the conservative side, hence the name neoconservative. And then there was a larger group of people who were simply called neoconservatives, even though they didn't self-identify because they didn't have the philosophical affiliation, nor were they really in that group that in the end of the 70s had been in the Democratic Party and shifted away. So that's really who neoconservatives are and where they come from. But in a pejorative sense, there are two meanings that it acquired as well. One was among other conservatives, the old line conservatives, the Henry Kissinger camp, as well as the Gerald Ford camp, the camp that never accepted Goldwater, never accepted Reagan as true conservatives, true Republicans. It was much more of a New England, more liberal form of conservatism. They looked at the neoconservatives as not true Republicans, not blue-blooded from old Republican families. And there was a great deal of hostility. And then there's another pejorative sense, which unfortunately gained a lot of traction, was the idea that it was just a Jewish conservative. And that was thrown out there to indicate that our positions really emanated from something other than American patriotism. They emanated from some dual loyalty or something by using that term.
And David, can you share with us how 9/11 on September the 11th, 2001, not only changed your life, but literally propelled you into the US government to be one of the main architects on the war on terror? And where were you on that fateful day? 20 years
well,
ago.
I was going to head to work, which at the time was still at the American Enterprise Institute. You know, this is September 2001. So the Bush administration, the Bush 43, the administration had already taken office 7, 8 months earlier. And I was already tapped by John Bolton to go into the State Department. And unfortunately, because Richard Armitage and Colin Powell, Secretary of State Colin Powell and Deputy Secretary Armitage, really didn't like the people I'd hung out with and didn't like John Bolton. They did everything they could to try to stop and slow down my security clearance, even though I'd had the highest possible level of security clearance from the Defense Intelligence Agency as part of my Navy intelligence work. So I had a security clearance far higher than what I would be getting at State. But they held it up to try to block my entry or at least slow it down. So in this period here, I was waiting 7, 8 months to get into the administration. And then suddenly 9/11 hit. I was heading to work at AEI. I was in the morning getting up. And all of a sudden, there it was on TV, the first plane that hit. And I saw that it was a big plane. I knew it wasn't some errant Piper Cub or small plane. I knew it was a big plane, and I knew big planes don't make mistakes like that. So I knew something horrible had just happened. And I turned to my wife and I said, this could be an act of war. And instead of getting dressed in my suit, I got dressed in my uniform. I assumed that I was going to be called up. I had retired from the Navy only a month or two earlier, but I knew that I was on a very short list to be recalled if anything happened. So I put on my uniform and started heading toward the Pentagon. And as I got in the car, the Pentagon was hit by an airplane. So there was nothing left to do but go back home and watch TV and mesmerized by what was happening for most of the day. Toward the end of the day, I actually went down to the Pentagon and met with Ken de Graffenried, who at the time was a senior official in the Pentagon. He says, I think we may need you. And I said, yeah, I'm pretty sure I'm going to be mobilized. He said, no, I think we need you for something else. So Paul Wolfowitz and Doug Feith and Richard Pearl, who was the head of the Defense Board, and Ken de Graffenried met with me that week in the burning Pentagon. The Pentagon was still burning. They were still pulling bodies out. And they told me, we need to figure out who hit us. We didn't know who hit us that day. They said, figure out who hit us and what the extent of it is. So I said, well, what exactly, where do you want me to start? What's the exact mission? And the directive I got was, we don't know, you figure it out. So it was a unique moment. There was a feeling like Pearl Harbor, that we're at war. We know we're at war, but we don't fully even understand with whom we're at war. And then toward the end of the week, Richard Pearl called me aside and he said, listen, when there's a great snowstorm and people get stuck in an airport, somehow musicians find each other. Somehow writers find each other. Scholars find each other. in the world out there, it seems that somehow terrorists find each other. And your job is to figure out how they do that and what the extent of the network was behind this. We know of this thing called Al Qaeda now, because by then they had claimed credit. But who are they? What's beyond them? Who are they connected to? And so I started, so they threw me in a little room. And for the next 3 months, using my clearance from the DIA, I studied the terror network that emerged and began to think about it in a warfighting capacity. Namely, if you think of taking down an electrical grid, you will see where all the cables go, the central nodes. That was exactly how I was looking at the terror network. And it became very clear early on that we were missing a lot of big questions and a lot of big connections. Ironically, Iraq was not such a big connection. It was much more Iran, to be honest, Syria, Libya. There were a lot of connections to a lot of players. And what emerged from that was a very clear picture that simply terrorism had become too easy a currency for dangerous regimes to employ. And they could pull them off the shelf. It wasn't that Saddam Hussein owned this terrorist group. He could turn to this, turn to that. And the second thing that was obvious was that many of the assumptions governing Washington not only were wrong, but they prevented us from understanding a lot of things that needed to be understood, to the extent where it contributed greatly to our inability to see the terror attack coming, even though we had evidence that a terror attack of such magnitude was coming.
And David, in the 9/11, the 9/11 Commission report, details very strongly that there was Iranian fingerprints on 9/11. And considering that Al Qaeda were based in Afghanistan, their only kind of real experience in terrorism was actually trying to defeat the Soviet forces in Afghanistan, as they were the Mujahideen, actually using IEDs and certain attacking Soviet tanks and military in kind of guerrilla warfare, to then go up that kind of level to take out the Twin Towers in New York as well as Pentagon. Surely that would have needed state intelligence behind it. Can you share with what you can about the possibility of Iranian involvement and that partnership between the Islamic Republic of Iran under their chief terrorist Imad Maghnia and Bin Laden and Al Qaeda?
Yeah, I don't know if any intelligence has been found since that directly links it to the Iranian regime in terms of some operational command or order uncovered. But one thing is clear, that an unusually large number of the 19 that committed the terrorist act, I believe it was 14, had been in Iran in the months prior to the attack. Now, what would Al Qaeda terrorists who are Sunnis be doing in Iran? It's a coincidence that begs an answer, and I think that alone is circumstantially grounds for suspicion of Iran's involvement. The fact that there were elements of the Shura, the council of Al Qaeda, that lived and resided in Iran, al-Masri, for example, some of the Egyptian terrorists who really were the mind behind Al Qaeda, lived in Tehran or lived in Iran. And then lastly, it was a strategic interest of, if you understand Al Qaeda as partly Saudi and partly Egyptian, Gamat al-Islamiyah, you understand how the Iranians had a strategic interest, having been perhaps one of the greatest enemies of Egypt after Egypt took in the Shah of Iran in his exile. They were enemies, and you could see Iran's footprints in helping some of these Islamist forces around the region. The second area, of course, that Iran was expert with was the first visitor to Tehran after the revolution was Yasser Arafat, and Imad Maghnia began in 417 under Yasser Arafat. So there was a strong hookup to this Sunni Palestinian terrorist world. So it wasn't really a leap to say that Iran had its fingerprints to some extent in the Al-Qaeda mission. Did they order it? We don't know if they ordered it. Again, there might be evidence since. I didn't see it at the time. But again, it showed the character of terror, which was that the regimes didn't command them always as forces. They would nurture them, and they knew the damage they would do and unleash would strategically serve their purposes. So they were implicated, but not operationally in control. And that always allowed for this plausible deniability. You saw the same mechanism with Yasser Arafat and Hamas, that he nurtured them, he gave them room, and he let them be. And he could never be pinned down for ordering a Hamas attack. But the use of Hamas as a terrorist organization was profound. The same, I think, with Iran. Terrorism had become the lingua franca of politics for a number of states. And that, of course, led to some of the strategic decisions that followed and the strategic fissures in the US government that arose from that.
And then, David, your career acceleration was to the to the heights of actually being the Middle Eastern policy advisor to Dick Cheney, who was the vice president under George W. Bush. And if the film Vice is correct, then he was the brains and the power behind George W. Bush and was effectively running the White House. What was it like to serve under Dick Cheney? And what kind of man is Dick Cheney?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. One can't believe everything one sees in the movies. So after that, I went to the State Department, and Richard Armitage essentially tried to railroad me into. I dealt mostly then with Iran issues rather than Iraq, because he prohibited me from dealing with anything in Iraq. But nonetheless, John Bolton and Vice President Chaney, and ultimately Scooter Libby, felt that it was a real waste for me to sit there boxed in like that, besieged by Richard Armitage. So after about 1.5 years, 2 years, John detailed me over to the vice president's office. I arrived there in the summer of 2003. About Dick Cheney, on the person, here was a man who was quite different than one would seem. Yes, he was a man of forceful ideas and a man of tremendously powerful principles, but he was also a very open-minded person who would listen. He was a great listener. I remember there were a number of memos I wrote to him, which were really harsh. They were basically, listen, our administration's getting this all wrong. This is just, it is from A to Z a mess up. And I thought that these memos would get me fired, and instead they got me called to his office, and he'd say, "Explain this. I hadn't seen it from this angle." And I have to say, often he would say, "Didn't think of that. You might be right. I got to think about it some more." And often as well, he concluded he was wrong and the memo was right. So this is a different man than one would see and believe existed out there. He was a man who listened. He also was probably one of the most intelligent people I've ever met. You told him a fact, it would never leave his brain. He knew it. He knew it years later. I remember an intelligence officer was briefing him once, and he mentioned the name of some very obscure Iranian facility that was attached marginally to a uranium mining operation. And the guy mispronounced or inverted it a little bit. He got the Farsi name a little bit off. And Chaney said, let me just get this straight. You mean, and he said the name correctly. This was something none of us who dealt with Iran day to day could have done. That's just a man. But as far as an influence on George Bush, when you have an intellect like that, he has an influence. They had meetings every week for a meal, and that was his primary influence. It was intellectual, it was these discussions. And every once in a while, if a memo went up to him that he liked, he would send it forward to the vice president, to the president. So he didn't have the power that's attributed to him in these movies. He didn't command anybody. He didn't have a bureaucracy under him. He had a staff in foreign policy of a couple dozen. And it was sheerly the power of the arguments being made and being able to convince the president and those around him that these were good ideas, and it wasn't ours to implement. So that was the power of the vice president. After the elections in 2004, his currency went down largely because they had the campaign. So his luncheons didn't happen, and his hands-on in the office with his own staff decreased in that period. So the flow of information, the contact with the president was minimized, and with it the influence also waned. So I'd say 2004 was the real turning point. And the National Security Advisor, Condoleezza Rice, who then became the Secretary of State, understood this mechanism or this dynamic, and very aggressively asserted herself into the relationship between the vice president and the president, and more or less kept the vice president at bay. I don't think his influence in the second term was anywhere near where it was in the first term.
Maybe that's explain why Bush's second term wasn't as effective as his first term. But onto the war in Iraq. Now, I kind of realized back in 2002 that this administration was going to topple Saddam Hussein because you wrote a book on it. I think it was just called Tyranny's Ally, in which you advocated the need for kind of regime change to remove Saddam Hussein from power. What do you think went wrong? Because back in 2002, I think the US administration were getting ready for a surprise attack on Iraq. And then we saw the intervention of our former Prime Minister, Tony Blair, who wanted to get the UN Security Council to actually agree and actually support the war in Iraq. So what effectively do you think went wrong? Or was the whole concept of building a state and building the infrastructure of a state in which Iraq after the war became almost a terrorist insurgency like Lebanon in the late 70s and 80s?
Well, Simon, I think you hit a lot of points there, all of which I think are correct. Let's deconstruct the war for a second. There were a lot of attempts to derail the war, and a lot of them dealt with arms control, that to prove we needed that it needed to go to the UN, which was a novel thing. The United States never recognized the UN as a sovereign body that would take precedence over the inherent right of self-defense, nor did we think that there was a legal reason why we couldn't resume the war, given that Saddam Hussein, already in its human rights aspects, was violating the 2001 ceasefire. So he was in breach already. We didn't need more evidence. The fact that he was gassing Shiites in the south and Kurds in the north was grounds enough. We also knew that there were violations. We weren't sure that, or even necessarily convinced that they rose to the level of active programs, but we knew that there was lying and cheating and preservation of programs. So for us, the legitimacy was there. The question was the strategic need there? And in the wake of 9/11 and the way we looked at terrorism, that there simply was a world of abysmal totalitarian tyranny throughout the region, and that this was leading to such an abysmal state of affairs in Arab politics that it was overflowing to the West. The terrorism, the violence, the refugees, the violence of refugees, the brutality. Something had changed in the 30, 40 years of Arab politics from the 50s and 60s to the 90s and noughts. where Arab politics had become so dangerous internally that it was overflowing externally, and we were beginning to pay a price for this in the West. So the fundamental problem of terrorism wasn't that Saddam sent a terrorist or Iran sent a terrorist. It was that the brutality of these regimes was dominating the language of Arab politics that we needed to start interacting with. And therefore, we had to address this. I don't want to say a democracy gap. There were a number of us who never wanted to use democracy, and there's strong reasons for that. But the freedom gap, the fact that most of the governments in these countries that most supported terrorism and employed terrorism, again, maybe not operationally, but nurtured it, were horrible regimes with tremendous internal brutality. We understood that stood at the heart of the problem. So we understood that Libya, Syria, Iraq, and Iran altogether ultimately can't really, and by the way, North Korea too, can't really survive this if we strategically pursue this, not necessarily invade all these countries. In fact, there was not much of a desire to invade any of these countries. But if we effected a regime change in all these countries, it would create a much safer environment, change the nature and the language of politics in the Middle East. About the invasion versus regime change, remember, neoconservatives grew up and were shaped by the events of Eastern Europe of 1989. There was no American invasion, and there was regime change in all the Eastern European countries in 1989, Central and Eastern European countries, and in the Soviet Union itself a year or two later in 91. So we understood the power of the United States, the influence of the United States, and the power of the people in those countries. And we were hoping to bring that sort of a strategy to the region to finally lean on these countries. In terms of the way to fight the war, Iraq by 2002, 2003, because the status quo was no longer tenable. It was collapsing, and we were facing the prospect of a breakout. Again, the war was justified publicly because of the people who wanted to oppose it, tried to hold it up by this arms control process. So the war became justified through arms control, which was a big mistake and should never have been done, because we had evidence Saddam was doing stuff, and we were sure, and we had evidence that he would do stuff the moment the sanctions were lifted. But the danger of Saddam, the acuteness of the danger of Saddam, was that we were entering a period where sanctions were collapsing and breakout could become possible. Not that he already had the breakout, but that he was about to do the breakout. All the studies of the war after the war bear that point out. They show that he had not yet broken out. There were no active arsenals of nuclear weapons or anything like that. But all the pieces were being put in place so that the day sanctions get lifted, there would be a surge capacity. But again, the war wasn't about the weapons. It was about the politics, the strategic conditions of the region, and that it was beginning to overflow and threaten the West profoundly.
And David, sadly, we're down to 6 minutes of the program. I'm going to have to do a part two because this is absolutely intriguing and also so gripping as well. So appreciate your insight. But with 6 minutes to go, was there a miscalculation on the part of what the Iranian regime would do? Because we know that after the toppling of Saddam Hussein and his evil sons in that regime, and you made very clear that this was a very, very evil regime, and it was a complete menace to the international community, let alone the Middle East. But did the US planners, when they were actually planning this war in Iraq, calculate the Iranian response? Because effectively the Iranians turned this into an insurgency, and other Middle Eastern states fearing that their regime could topple next, the Tehran could fall, Damascus could fall, with the American and US coalition forces right in the heart of the Middle East.
Yeah, I think one of the big mistakes was when we went in heavy. We went in as a nation building, as occupation and nation building. And I think that the whole concept of using the Iraqi National Congress it was to go in much lighter and turn over Iraq to them very quickly. Uh, and they then would have to deal with the circumstances on the ground and so forth. And we basically would hand the Iraqi people their chance. They would take it or they wouldn't take it. We couldn't make the Iraqis free. They would have to do it themselves. But nevertheless, it was based on sort of the Free French model in World War II. And a lot of that was influenced by Israel's experience in Lebanon, that it was the prolonged occupation that was so devastating to the IDF and to the Israelis, and eventually led to their defeat in Lebanon. And we wanted to avoid that. And we thought the way to avoid that is to build up Iraqi factions that would take over almost immediately. Unfortunately, the concept that governed our entry was a massive invasion. And then we became essentially the colonial masters of Iraq for many years. And it made us easy targets for an insurgency that the Iranians launched. And so I think there was there was a lack of appreciation of how dangerous Iran would be. And with this massive troop presence in Iraq, the default, which unfortunately I think Sawyers and others in Britain pushed very hard and convinced Condoleezza Rice and the Americans of, was that the path to pacify the Shiites in southern Iraq lay through Tehran, that you have to come to an accommodation with Tehran. And by the way, Colin Powell, this was his concept, and Richard Armitage, and they were using the British as the conduits for their own policy fights within the US government. So I think that was a flawed concept. The Iranians never had a desire to pacify the Shiites in the south against us. They used every single bit of influence we yielded to them to kill us and to wage a war of insurgency against us. And I think it took us 2-3 years before we figured that out. When we finally did, we turned it around fairly quickly. But truly, the concept that Colin Powell and Sawyers had of everything flowing through Tehran in terms of the Shiites was devastatingly a miscalculation that almost cost us the war at that point.
And David, with about 3 minutes to go of the program, do you think that the US administration was too much influenced by Tony Blair himself? Because we know that one of the agreements why he came into the coalition with the United States to remove Saddam Hussein from power was because he wanted a Palestinian state to win the support of the left so that he could advance his political ambitions to become the first president of the United States of Europe.
Yeah, Tony Blair and President Bush were fairly close. I mean, it was quite a unique interaction. And Colin Powell understood this very well. And Colin Powell understood as well that he didn't have the balance of power in the US government, and he was not happy with policy under Bush. He and Condoleezza Rice were at odds. If you look at Condoleezza Rice as one of the more softer or more diplomatic sides of the Bush administration, that was still way too far conservative for Colin Powell. So he understood he'd lost, that he could not influence and move policy in a certain way inside the US government, nor was he willing to accept the decisions that the President Bush made or the security cabinet of President Bush. So he understood the mechanism to do so was to use the personal relationship that Tony Blair had with the president. And he essentially used the British structure as an internal counterbalance against the United States. He then expanded that to the EU3 as a whole, using that structure, Germany, France, and Britain, as a counterweight internally, really, to the US government against the others in the US government. So that was the role that Britain played. And it was really unfortunate because I think the British had a lot to offer. This pigeonholed Britain into an internal fight in the United States, which Britain shouldn't have been involved with.
And finally, within 30 seconds, David, what is it like to actually serve the US administration and to actually serve the United States by being one of the main foreign policy advisors on the Middle East to the George W. Bush administration?
Well, I mean, many people say this. It sounds like a cliche that it's sobering, but it is. I remember walking in one day and seeing the White House at work and seeing the White House and just telling myself, you know, how many people in my country can see this? There are 300 and some million people in America. And I'm so stunned and privileged to be. It was really quite sobering. And I kept thinking in terms of my mom who had fled Czechoslovakia, my dad who had survived in the shadow of the Holocaust in Switzerland. How did I come from that background to where I was? It was shocking, and it kept sobering me and reminding me I'm not there because of me. I'm there because of America.
David, I just want to thank you so much for giving us so much of an insight into your experience being the advisor to Dick Cheney in the White House on the Middle East and also Iraq. And we have to do a part two because I think we've only just touched the surface. So thank you for joining me from the States today. And I just want to thank you for watching this exclusive interview with Dr. David Wurmser, one of the architects of US foreign policy to the Middle East during the Bush administration. And we've got to be proud that God has placed such men of power and influence in these positions who have a heart and love for his land, the nation of Israel and the Jewish people. So I want to thank you for watching this home edition of the Middle East Report.